The batter hid more than flour. It concealed a killer's touch. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host, Harrington. I always enjoy hearing from you. Comment your city or country. Every note you leave means a lot. Let's begin. I don't keep a record of how many people ring our bell claiming they need Nero Wolfe's help because someone looked at them funny, served them the wrong soup, or committed what they believe to be a Class A felony by ignoring their aunt's birthday. But if I did, I'd have filed this one under harmless nuisance if it weren't for the cinnamon. Yes, cinnamon. It was 10 minutes past 11, and I was exactly one sentence into the crossword in the Gazette, trying to decide whether a 5-letter word for spicy surprise was zingy or amour when the doorbell buzzed. I swung the door open with the ease of a man who's done it too often, and there she was, tall, silver-haired, and wearing an apron with a spatula sticking out of the pocket like a badge of office. "I'm here to see Mr. Wolfe," she said, crisply. "I have a matter of culinary betrayal. I was about to offer one of my standard deflections. We get 3 food-related appeals a week, not counting the cranks, when she added, 'It's about a recipe, a death, and a bakery that might be the scene of sabotage.'" That last word snagged my interest like a loose thread. I raised an eyebrow and stepped aside. "Come in, Mrs. Alva Strickland." She brushed past me with the kind of self-possession usually reserved for head mistresses and Michelin-starred chefs. I led her to the front room and buzzed the call button. Wolfe didn't answer immediately, which told me he was either trying to ignore the interruption or deciding if the word sabotage was worth rearranging his morning routine. A minute later, the reply came, clipped and reluctant. "Archie, bring her up." Upstairs in the office, Wolfe was in his usual seat, the yellow silk pajamas traded in for his brown checked suit, and his gaze already fixed on Mrs. Strickland like she was a new specimen of orchid fungus. He didn't stand, of course. "May sit. Mr. Goodwin tells me you are aggrieved by a culinary betrayal." "Explain." Mrs. Strickland sat upright, her hands clasped. "I own and operate Buttercrumbs, a bakery on 72nd. We specialize in heritage pastries, receipts, not recipes, mind you, handed down from generations of New England grandmothers and Brooklyn aunties. A week ago, we were finalists for a national baking competition, the Golden Spoon. A big deal. In our world." Wolfe made a sound somewhere between a grunt and a sigh. I knew he hated baking contests. Too much ego, not enough clarity. "During the final phase," she continued, "we submitted a family heirloom entry, cinnamon crumb cake. My grandmother's from 1912. Except what the judges tasted wasn't my crumb cake. It was dry, bland, and frankly an insult. Someone had tampered with the batch." "Tampered?" Wolfe drawled. "You make it sound like arson." "It was sabotage. The batter was correct when it went into the oven. But afterward, before, judging something was wrong, the sugar was off, the crumb too coarse, and worse." She hesitated, her voice lowering. "One of the assistants, a young man named Milo Vance, collapsed in the kitchen during cleanup. He was taken to Mount Sinai. They say it might have been an allergic reaction or a toxin. He hasn't regained consciousness." That made Wolfe's eyes lift from the armrest to her face. "So," I said, leaning against the credenza, "you're saying someone messed with the batter to sabotage your entry and possibly poisoned your assistant in the process?" "Exactly. But no one will take me seriously. The event organizers won't acknowledge tampering. The hospital won't share details without family consent. And the other competitors act like I'm paranoid." Wolfe let the silence stretch a moment longer than comfort allowed, then said, "Why have you come to me?" Mrs. Strickland adjusted her apron pocket. "Because someone in that kitchen did something they shouldn't have, and I need someone who can smell deceit the way I smell nutmeg in a warm bowl of batter." "Pah! I do not smell anything." Wolfe closed his eyes. "I have no interest in competitive gastronomy, and even less in vague accusations." "But it wasn't vague," she said, her tone tightening. "Before Milo collapsed, he told me something strange. He said, You didn't add the vanilla, someone else did. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Then he dropped. That got Wolfe's eyelids open again. And the bowl, she added. The one we used for mixing, it vanished. Reappeared in the sink half an hour later. Clean. Too clean. You're implying, then, Wolfe said, that someone swapped bowls, sabotaged the batter, possibly poisoned it, and tried to erase the evidence. I glanced at Wolfe, expecting another brush-off. Instead, he stared at her a moment, then turned to me. Archie. Yes, sir? You will accompany Mrs. Strickland to her bakery. Examine the environment, question those present, and retrieve anything relevant. I wish to know more about this bowl, I blinked. You're taking the case? I am considering it. This is not a murder investigation, yet. But the intersection of gustatory manipulation and attempted harm intrigues. Miko! He closed his eyes again. Mrs. Strickland rose, triumphant. I walked her to the door, still processing Wolfe's sudden interest. Maybe it was the mention of the mixing bowl. Maybe it was the idea of someone meddling in a kitchen, the only territory Wolfe considered sacred besides his orchid rooms, or maybe, just maybe, he'd caught the same whiff I had. Something was wrong, not just in the batter. The bakery sat on the corner of 72nd and Amsterdam, wedged between a wine shop that hadn't restocked in months and a dry cleaner whose storefront offered fading promises of same-day service. Buttercrumbs, at least from the outside, looked like it took itself seriously. Panelled wood, a tidy striped awning, and a gold leaf sign that gave off an air of generations-old pride. I opened the door for Mrs. Strickland and followed her inside. The scent hit me before the warmth did. Vanilla, cinnamon, and something richer underneath. Inside, a woman with ginger curls and a powdered nose was rearranging lemon bars with the precision of a jeweler. She gave us the look people usually save for suspicious meat. "This is Mr. Goodwin," Alva said with crisp authority. "He's here to help clarify some things." The woman's nostrils flared like she was preparing to sniff out an intruder. "You're not a cop." "Right," I said cheerfully. "I'm the guy people call when they're tired of being ignored by cops." That earned me a blink. Then, reluctantly, "Paige, I managed the front counter." I tipped my hat, which I wasn't wearing, and followed Alva past her. We walked through a swinging door into the rear kitchen, where the real heart of the operation beat. Stainless steel counters gleamed under track lighting. Cooling racks lined the wall, empty at the moment. A chalkboard above the prep table still bore a half-erased checklist. Butter, crumb, bowl. "There were 5 people in here during the competition prep," Alva said. "Myself, Milo Vance, our assistant, Paige out front, and 2 interns. We borrowed from the culinary program at City College, Dell and Isaiah." She gestured toward a storage corridor to the right. Milo collapsed near the spice shelf. I was at the oven. Paige was checking the storefront. I heard him call out, then he went down. I crouched near the spice rack. Nothing jumped out except the smell. Cinnamon. Yes. "That was one of the things," she said. "I remember Milo said, 'The cinnamon's wrong.' The jar in front of me was labeled Corinthia, mild sweet. It was half full, but it looked off, clumpier than it should be. I opened it, gave it a sniff. It smelled like cinnamon, yes, but sharper. Something underneath it I didn't like. I looked up. "Mind if I take this?" "Please, take anything you need." There was a clipboard on the counter. I flipped through the prep logs. On the morning in question, someone had scribbled "extra batch" next to the crumb mix. Below it, "bowls. Swapped, blew out, steel in." "Who wrote that?" I asked. She came to my side. "That's Dell's handwriting. He's meticulous. If something changes, he documents it. I didn't notice that until just now." "Where is Dell now?" "Still here. He comes in evenings, but I can call him." I nodded. "And Milo?" She frowned. "Still in the hospital. His sister's with him. The doctors aren't saying much, only that it wasn't a food allergy. They're testing for contaminants. I'll want to speak with her too. She hesitated. That may not. Be easy, she's distrustful. She doesn't like outsiders, even me. I'll charm her, or at least annoy her into cooperating. The swinging door flapped open, and a lanky young man with tortoise-shell glasses and a hairnet poked his head in. "Dell," Alva called. "This is Mr. Goodwin. He's here about the bowl." Dell blinked. "The steel one?" "That's the one." He came in and stood awkwardly like a cat about to knock something off a counter just to see what would happen. "I noted it," he said. "That day, when I came in around noon, I saw—" The blue ceramic bowl had been set aside, clean. That was supposed to be for the crumb batter, but there was a stainless steel one in the sink, also clean but damp. "I made a note because it didn't fit our rotation." "You're sure?" He nodded. "Absolutely, I checked it twice." "What about the vanilla?" I asked. He blinked. "What about it?" "Milo said something about it before he passed out. Said someone else had added it." Dell rubbed the back of his neck. "That's strange. We don't pre-mix it in. It goes in during the second fold, usually by Alva." "I did add it," Alva said. "I always do," Dell frowned. "But when I checked the bottle later, it was almost empty. And that morning it had been half full. I figured Paige had been baking early." I made a mental note and asked to see the bottle. It was in a drawer. The label had been half rubbed off, the glass sticky. A faint scent still clung to the rim, but it was slightly bitter, not what you'd expect. "Okay," I said. "Dell, can you give me a list of everyone who had access to this room between 8 and noon on the day of the judging?" He nodded. "Besides me, Alva, and Paige, Isaiah, Milo, obviously, and—" He stopped. "And?" "There was someone else. A woman. I didn't catch her name. She came in around 11. Said she was from the event committee. Said she was here to observe. Had a clipboard, glasses, clipboard badge, looked official." "Did she interact with the prep?" He hesitated. "She asked about our flour sources, and then, while Alva was in the front and Milo was organizing the pans, she stood near the batter for a while. Said she was checking process. I didn't think anything of it." "Could you describe her?" "Short, brown hair in a bun, wearing beige, didn't smile. Sounds like a dentist." "No, more like an accountant." I jotted it down. "That made 6 people in a tight space with a bowl that got swapped, cinnamon that smelled wrong, vanilla that went missing, and an assistant who dropped unconscious after saying something cryptic. It was enough to take back to Wolfe, even if most of it sounded half-baked." I thanked them both, grabbed the cinnamon jar and the vanilla bottle, and headed back to the brownstone. By the time I stepped into the office and laid them on Wolfe's desk, he didn't even look up. He simply asked, "Did the bowl speak?" Not quite, but the cinnamon grumbled. Wolfe's eyes opened slowly. He reached for the cinnamon, unsealed the jar, and gave it a single measured sniff. Then he closed the lid, leaned back and said, "Someone is using the art of baking for very uncivilized purposes, Archie. We shall oblige them by responding with civilization, precisely applied." It was the Wolfe version of a declaration of war, and judging by the furrow in his brow, the enemy had just burned their own cake. The next morning, Wolfe didn't emerge from the plant rooms until nearly 10, which meant Fritz and I were free to have breakfast without a soliloquy on the virtues of brown eggs or an impassioned condemnation of over-toasted rye. When he did appear, it was with the silent, deliberate tread of a man who had already solved the crime in his head and was merely waiting for the rest of us to catch up. He lowered himself into the red leather chair, flicked a glance at the cinnamon. Jarryd returned to the desk and said, "Phooey, this is not Corinthia cinnamon. It may once have been, but it's been adulterated." "With what?" I asked, setting down my coffee. "I do not know, but it possesses a chemical undertone. Bitter, uncooked, synthetic, not sufficient to cause harm in the quantities typically used." but enough to alter flavor and perhaps induce nausea in the susceptible. And Milo Vance wasn't just susceptible. He passed out cold. Wolfe raised a finger. We do not yet know whether what affected him was related to this, nor can we exclude the possibility of coincidence. But, as you are aware, I do not believe in coincidence. That's what makes our job harder and your reputation better. He accepted the compliment with a grunt. Archie, you will telephone Mr. Saul Panzer. Ask him to find out everything available on the following persons: Mrs. Alva Strickland, Miss Paige Kroll, Mr. Del Bishop, Mr. Isaiah Green, and Mr. Milo Vance. Focus on financial strain, past employment disputes, family issues, and criminal records, if any. Also ask Saul to identify the woman who allegedly claimed to be from the event committee. I nodded and reached for the phone. Wolfe tapped the desk again. In addition, request a toxicological analysis from Inspector Kramer's lab using this cinnamon sample under pretext of an unrelated poisoning. We'll deal with the red tape later. Kramer's going to love that, I said. I'll be sure to phrase it as a personal favor to you. He will appreciate the challenge, Wolfe said dryly. Once the call to Saul was made, and the verbal dance with Kramer's answering lieutenant complete, I left the brownstone for the next part of my fieldwork. The key to untangling the mess in the bakery lay in the people, not the pastry, and that meant talking to Milo's sister. Mount Sinai smelled like antiseptic and resignation. The nurse at the ICU directed me to a waiting room where a woman with dark-rimmed glasses and a notebook was sipping bad coffee and glaring at the linoleum like it had personally offended her. "You're Donna Vance," I said. "Milo's sister." She gave me a slow, appraising look, then nodded. "I'm Archie Goodwin. I'm helping someone who believes what happened to Milo wasn't an accident." Her face didn't change, but I saw the slight shift in her body, just enough to suggest relief mixed with suspicion. "I don't want reporters near him. Or lawyers, or bakery drama queens looking for pity." "Good, I'm none of those. I'm a licensed investigator working with Mr. Nero Wolfe. We're looking into the cause of your brother's collapse. I was told he made a comment to someone before he went down." Her eyes sharpened. "About vanilla?" "Exactly. He said someone else added it, and the cinnamon didn't smell right." She looked away, tapping her thumbnail against the coffee cup. "Milo's always had a strong sense of smell. Like a bloodhound. Ever since he was a kid, he could tell when I was sneaking sugar into cereal from across the room. Has he ever had reactions like this before? No. He's not allergic to anything. That's the part that makes no sense. His vitals were fine. Then he just fell. The doctors thought it might be a seizure, but the scans came back clean. And no other injuries, bruises, scratches." She hesitated. "There was a scratch on his wrist. Looked like it had been cleaned up before I saw it." The nurse thought. It might have been from a fall, or someone grabbing him. Her silence was an answer. I handed her a card. "If anything changes, call me. If he wakes up, I want to talk to him." "I'll call if he opens his eyes," she said, then added, "And tell your boss, whoever he is, that Milo would never mess up a recipe, not even by accident." I left her with that, drove back downtown, and found a message waiting for me. From Saul. Back at the brownstone, I handed Wolfe the summary. "Paige Kroll," I said, "filed for bankruptcy 3 years ago, owed $30,000 to various creditors, including 2 old restaurant supply firms, worked in 4 bakeries in 7 years, fired twice. One employer claimed she was caught altering inventory logs." Wolfe grunted. "Del Bishop's clean," I continued. "Too clean. Spends his evenings auditing food safety blogs, 1 ticket for subway fare evasion, likely neurotic, not malicious. Green. Isaiah Green got a DWI last year, license suspended. No violence, no debts. Was also written up once at a prior job for a screaming match with a pastry chef. No follow-up. And the woman? Here's the kicker. Saul couldn't find a record of any event committee personnel matching Dell's. Description: no one scheduled for observation, no clipboarded beige ghost. She's either a fraud or she was never meant to be known. Wolfe pursed his lips. This is increasingly unpleasant. Unpleasant? I find sabotage distasteful, he said. It lacks elegance. It is a crime of cowards. I set the cinnamon jar down again. Then we're dealing with a coward, who might also be a poisoner. Possibly. Or an opportunist. I still require more information. You will return to Buttercrumbs tomorrow. Speak to Isaiah Green. Pose as an interested buyer. Test his temperament. And if he throws flour at me, you will respond with your usual tact. Wolfe closed his eyes. That was my cue to leave. I didn't need a calendar to know the game was accelerating. Wolfe had only used Saul this early in the investigation once before, and that case had ended with an arrest and a lawsuit. This one had cinnamon, secrecy, and something that didn't smell right, literally or figuratively. And Wolfe had just started to lean forward. The next day I timed my arrival at Buttercrumbs for just after 9, when ovens were on full blast and most sane New Yorkers were thinking more about coffee than crime. The storefront was already bustling with an early morning rush, commuters grabbing scones like they were life preservers. I spotted Paige behind the counter, this time with a tighter bun and a looser smile, possibly because she hadn't seen me yet. I gave her a nod and slipped through the swinging door into the kitchen. Isaiah Green was easy to spot. Tall, lean, and wearing a white apron that looked like it had been through a war. He had a tattoo of a whisk on one forearm, and the expression of a man who measured his self-worth in precise tablespoons. He was folding batter into a mixing bowl like it owed him rent. I waited until he looked up. Isaiah Green. He nodded. Yeah? Archie Goodwin. I'm with Nero Wolfe. He set down his bowl with more gentleness than I usually give a sandwich and wiped his hands on his apron. The guy with the orchids? That's the one. But today we're less interested in flora and more interested in flower. I'd like to ask you a few questions about what happened last week. He shrugged, but there was tension in his shoulders. I already talked to the event organizers. They said there was no proof anything happened. Just a bad bake and bad luck. Maybe. But the thing about luck is it rarely cleans bowls and swaps spices on its own. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he moved toward the sink and began rinsing measuring spoons with meticulous care. Look, I don't know what happened. That day was chaos. Alva was stressing. Milo was buzzing around like a bee on espresso. Dell was having a mild panic attack over the size of the crumb layer. Paige was barking at customers. And you? I was doing what I always do, prep and backup. Were you near the batter? Not really. I was mostly working on lemon tarts. Milo and Alva were handling the crumb cake. Did you see anyone near the batter who shouldn't have been? He hesitated for a moment, too long. There was some woman, he said finally. Clipboard. Looked official. Said she was there to observe sanitation protocol. Did you catch her name? No, but I remember her asking about ingredient sources. She made a comment about the cinnamon being surprisingly bold. I thought that was weird. It was the same stuff we always use. You didn't think to mention this before, I told the organizers. They shrugged, said she must have been from the committee. Honestly, I didn't think much of it, until Milo went down. He paused, then added, that kid had a nose like a truffle pig. If something was off, he'd catch it. I studied Green's face. There was no defensiveness there, just frustration simmering under a layer of calm. I'd seen it before. People who knew they'd witnessed something wrong but didn't act because they thought it wasn't their place. Guilt in the passive tense. Do you think someone sabotaged the batter? I think, he said slowly, that someone wanted us to lose. And I think Milo got in the way. Any idea who would want that? A shrug. We were front runners. People talked. Said we were too polished, too professional. The judges liked our precision. Maybe someone wanted more authentic messiness to win. Maybe someone didn't like Alva. I let that sit a second, then asked, "How's your relationship with her?" "Professional. I've only worked here 6 months. She's strict but fair. Pays on time, doesn't yell unless someone deserves it. That's rare in this industry." "Anyone here not fond of her?" That got me another pause. "Paige has worked with her longest. They fight. A lot. Paige thinks she's underpaid. Dell's just neurotic. He doesn't like confrontation, but he doesn't like her either. He thinks she micromanages. And Milo?" He shook his head. "Milo was loyal. He worshipped her. Said she saved his life, whatever that means." That made my eyebrows rise. "Did he say how?" "No. Just that he'd been in a bad place. Drugs, maybe. Never said. He kept things light, but he'd follow her off a cliff." I nodded, thanked him, and turned to leave. As I pushed back through the door into the front room, Paige was sliding muffins into the display with the delicate aggression of someone swatting flies. "Miss Kroll," I said as I approached the counter. "Got a moment?" She gave me a look, like I'd just asked her to help move a piano. "I'm a little busy. Sure, I just need to ask about a clipboard-toting woman who visited the kitchen during judging day. Said she was with the committee. You remember her?" Her mouth tightened. "Vaguely." "Was she real?" "What kind of question is that?" "The kind you ask when nobody else on the committee seems to know who she is." Paige leaned in slightly, her voice low. "I thought it was odd. She didn't sign the visitor log. Usually we get a heads up about observers, but I figured it was a last-minute substitution. Describe her. Beige sweater, dark hair in a bun. Looked like she hated carbs, seemed more interested in people than process." "Did she touch?" "Anything. I don't know, I was up front most of the time, but she lingered near the crumb station, asked Dell a bunch of questions." "You didn't follow up?" She shrugged. "I was dealing with 3 customers asking for gluten-free croissant. That's sabotage enough." I left her to her pastries and drove back to the brownstone. Wolfe was waiting. I gave him the rundown. "She existed," I said. "Everyone saw her. No one knows who she was. She hovered near the batter, asked weird questions, then disappeared. Paige said she didn't sign the log. And get this, Green remembers her commenting that the cinnamon was bold. That sounds more like a field test than a compliment." Wolfe pressed his fingertips together. "Then she is either a saboteur posing as an official or an official who exceeded her mandate. Either way, she introduced a variable with consequences." The scratch on Milo's wrist. Perhaps. She attempted to remove something he noticed, an object, a label. Or perhaps she injected something into the batter while distracting the others. "You think she drugged the cinnamon?" Wolfe closed his eyes. "The analysis is pending. But, yes, I consider it plausible." "And motive?" "That," Wolfe said, "remains to be uncovered. There is money in winning competitions, publicity, pride, but I suspect a more intimate driver. Spite, perhaps, or revenge." The doorbell rang. I left the office expecting a delivery or a crank, but when I opened the door it was a man in a tan blazer with tired eyes and a flat voice. "I'm Detective Harold. I'm looking into the collapse of Milo Vance." I let him in, already knowing Wolfe wouldn't like the intrusion. Still, something about the detective's expression told me he wasn't here to warn us off. He looked more like a man who'd stumbled over something troubling and was now trying to get his footing. "I think," he said as I led him into the office, "we might be looking at something more serious than sabotage." Wolfe arched an eyebrow. "Indeed," Harold nodded. "Milo Vance didn't collapse from an allergic reaction. He was poisoned." Wolfe didn't move a muscle. Not even an eyebrow twitched. But the temperature in the office dropped a few degrees. "Poisoned," he said quietly. "What substance?" Detective Harold removed a folded sheet of paper from his inside pocket and laid it gently on Wolfe's desk like it might explode. Preliminary tox screen came back early this morning. Trace amounts of acrylamide and a concentrated bitterant compound, something not typically present in culinary-grade cinnamon. We've sent it to a lab upstate for more precise identification, but we're already treating the incident as intentional. I leaned forward. Acrylamide, isn't that the stuff that forms in certain foods during high-temperature cooking? Right, Harold replied. It's a byproduct, but not in these quantities. Someone enhanced it, deliberately. There were also traces of a synthetic compound used in industrial cleaners, bitter as hell, and dangerous in even small doses if ingested. Wolfe turned his head slightly. That, in his world, was the equivalent of flinging a chair across the room. Was the delivery vector determined? He asked. We're still narrowing it down, Harold said, but our best guess, the cinnamon, which coincidentally Mrs. Strickland says had been acting strange before the collapse, which you, Mr. Goodwin, corroborated in your report. Wolfe's eyelids sank closed. And you suspect this was targeted? I do, Harold said, and not at Milo at the judges. Milo just got there first. Bah, Wolfe muttered. Crude, amateur, an indiscriminate application of a weapon designed to damage reputation and endanger lives. No precision, no elegance. That's why I'm here. We know you're consulting unofficially. I'd appreciate it if you shared what you find. Wolfe opened his eyes again. I may, if it suits my purpose. I act on my own discretion. Understood. Harold stood. I'll leave you to it. But we'll need to interview everyone on the premises that day again. Formally this time. I escorted him to the door, then returned to the office. Wolfe hadn't moved. His hands were pressed together in that steepled formation that meant his brain was grinding away like a turbine. Archie, he said, the saboteur poisoned the cinnamon in small quantities, too small to kill outright, but enough to undermine flavor, cause illness, and suggest incompetence. The plan, I infer, was to destroy the reputation of Mrs. Strickland and her bakery, possibly to remove her from the competition entirely. And Milo just caught it by accident. Or by loyalty. You told me he worshipped her. Right. Green said he'd follow her off a cliff. Then perhaps he took it upon himself to verify her work, or tasted the batter to check for purity. That would make him an accidental casualty. I nodded slowly. So the real target was Alva. Someone wanted her eliminated from the baking scene, not just beaten, disgraced. Exactly. And the suspects? Wolfe tapped the desk. Begin with Miss Kroll. She was financially troubled, resentful, and had unrestricted access to the ingredients. Her history includes prior inventory tampering. She is not subtle, but she is opportunistic. Next, Del Bishop, unlikely, methodical, observant, and far too literal-minded, but not impossible. Isaiah Green, temperamental, possibly impulsive, less likely to plot than to react. But if he believed sabotage was justifiable revenge, perhaps. Then there's our mystery woman. The beige ghost, Wolfe grunted. Yes, she must be found. The timing of her appearance and the disappearance of the bowl are too coincidental. She may be the saboteur or the instrument of one. I'll call Saul, I said, rising. If she's real, he'll find her. I left the office and made the call. Saul didn't need much prompting. I gave him the description again and asked him to start with former event staff, temp agencies, and culinary competition rosters. Anyone who might have passed as an official but had no business in that kitchen. Then I called the bakery. Page answered on the second ring. Buttercrumbs. Miss Kroll, this is Archie Goodwin. I need you to come to the brownstone this afternoon. There was a pause. Why? Because we have questions, and because if you're innocent, now would be a good time to prove it. She hung up, which was rude but promising. Within 2 hours, She arrived at the brownstone wearing what she probably considered her version of courtroom attire: grey slacks, a stiff white blouse, and lipstick that looked recently applied and rapidly regretted. Fritz showed her to the office. Wolfe, still seated like a monolith, didn't rise or gesture. He just stared. "Miss Kroll," he said, "I will speak frankly. I dislike ambiguity and I dislike deception. I believe someone at your bakery introduced a poisoned substance into a public culinary competition. Mr. Vance nearly died. I intend to identify the culprit." "I didn't poison anyone," she said quickly, arms crossed. "Then you will not object to answering questions." Wolfe gestured faintly and I took over. "You were in the kitchen that morning. Did you handle the cinnamon?" "No, that's always on the prep shelf. Dell measures it out. I handle front orders and plating." "Did you notice anything unusual about the ingredient shelf?" "No." "Did you see anyone go near it who shouldn't have?" Her eyes narrowed. "Besides the clipboard woman?" "Yes." "No. But honestly, I wasn't watching the shelf. I was dealing with the register and cleaning up spilled espresso from a tourist who thought he'd invented iced coffee. Were you aware the judges were scheduled to taste Alva's crumb cake at noon?" "Yes, and that a poor showing could disqualify her." She shifted. "It wasn't about that. I mean, yes, but the cake wasn't the issue. It was the reputation." Wolfe leaned forward a fraction. "Elaborate." Paige looked down. "Alva had a reputation for perfection. Everyone in the industry knew it. If she won the Golden Spoon, she'd be unstoppable. But if she failed spectacularly, if her signature dish was ruined, it'd spread. Fast. No one wants to buy from a bakery that serves dry, flavorless cakes." I asked, "Are you saying you wanted her to fail?" She looked up sharply. "No, but someone did. Someone who wanted her out of the way. Maybe a competitor, or someone who thought she didn't deserve the spotlight." "Such as?" Her voice dropped. "You should ask her about her old business partner, the one she doesn't talk about." Wolfe raised an eyebrow. "Name?" She hesitated, then said, "Cecilia Dunn. They co-owned a bakery 10 years ago in Brooklyn. It folded. Bad blood. Cecilia resurfaced a year ago. She runs her own place now. And rumor says she hates Alva's guts." Wolfe turned to me. "Archie, I'm on it." As Paige left, Wolfe sat silently for a full minute. Then he murmured, "We have a motive. We have a method. Now we need the missing hand." He turned his head, eyes heavy-lidded. "Find Cecilia Dunn. Speak to her, and ask Saul to check her name against every temp agency in the city." I grabbed my coat. The ghost in beige might have just gotten a name. Cecilia Dunn's bakery was called Sweet Providence, and it sat on a gentrified corner of Carroll Gardens where the flower boxes cost more than my rent in Queens. The awning was a soft robin's egg blue, the windows spotless, and the chalkboard sign out front read, "Today's special, bourbon pecan pie with a dash of grace." Grace wasn't the word that came to mind when I stepped inside. The place reeked of curated charm, vintage mixing bowls on display, Edison bulbs dangling from reclaimed wood beams, and a playlist heavy on soulful acoustic covers of songs that didn't need improving. Behind the counter, a blonde woman with angular cheekbones and a posture that said "control freak" turned as I entered. "May I help you?" she asked, polite enough to be legal. "Cecilia Dunn?" "Yes." I showed her my card. "Archie Goodwin. I'm investigating an incident involving your former business partner, Alva Strickland." Her expression didn't flicker. "I haven't spoken to Alva in 10 years. "That's a long grudge." She folded her arms. "Is that what this is, a grudge, I'm asking?" "Well, no, it's not. We parted ways, philosophical differences. She was old school, I was progressive, that was it." "Progressive how?" "She believed in protecting old recipes. I believed in evolving them. She said food was memory. I said it was potential. We disagreed. Repeatedly. Must have been some disagreement. Word is you hate her guts." She gave a tight smile. Word exaggerates. I respect her talent. I question her rigidity. And were you at the Golden Spoon event last week? Her smile widened. No, I wasn't invited. Were you near Buttercrumbs that morning? No, I was here preparing for a wedding order. Ask my staff. 30 cupcakes shaped like opera glasses. I made a note. Anyone else who might have taken issue with her success? On your behalf? I'm flattered you think I inspire minions, Mr. Goodwin, but no, I'm busy building a brand, not plotting poisonings. Her tone was smooth, but something about it was too smooth, like someone who rehearsed for a performance no one ever promised. I thanked her, left a polite threat of follow-up, and stepped back out into the Brooklyn air. A few blocks away, I called Saul. She says she was at her shop all morning. I need you to verify that. Also check if anyone from her staff ever worked temp jobs, especially ones involving culinary events. Saul grunted, which meant he was already halfway through the request before I'd finished. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was pruning a cluster of cattleyas and barely acknowledged my return. I gave him the rundown. She's polished. Denies. Everything. Says she was knee-deep in wedding cupcakes all morning. Bah, Wolfe said without turning. A wedding is not an alibi. It is an emotional smokescreen. You believe she is lying? I believe she's rehearsed, and the kind of person who doesn't do dirty work personally. Then she may have a proxy, I nodded. Saul's checking her staff. Good. Wolfe clipped a blossom. Now listen. I have reviewed the financial records Saul obtained. Sever Buttercrumbs. They show a recent spike in insurance coverage, specifically a clause covering business interruption due to defamation or scandal, taken out by Mrs. Strickland 2 months ago. That made me sit up straighter. So she was anticipating something, or advised to prepare for it, perhaps warned. I whistled softly. You think someone tipped her off? I think she suspected trouble. Whether because of a threat or intuition, I do not know. But the timing is notable. Would she poison her own batter to trigger the policy? Wolfe shook his head. Too risky, too crude, and her reaction has been too consistent. No, I believe she feared an attack but misjudged its form. The phone rang. I answered. Saul's voice came through, quiet and sharp. I've got a hit. Talk. One of Dunn's part-time decorators. Woman. Named Melinda Cairn. Did 2 short stints with a temp agency that staffs culinary expos, including the Golden Spoon event. My heart kicked up a gear. Physical description? Short. Brown hair. Usually in a bun. Pale. Wears beige like... It's a uniform. The ghost. Seems likely. I checked her address. Want me to pay a visit? Not yet. Let me clear it with the boss. I covered the receiver and told Wolfe. She exists, I said. Melinda Cairn, decorator for Dunn, was at the event in an official capacity. No actual affiliation with the committee. Wolfe's eyes closed slowly. Send Saul. Tell him to watch, not engage. I want to know who she sees, who she calls, and where she hides the beige. I passed that along and hung up. Wolfe rose from his chair, signaling a shift in tempo. Archie, we are nearly there. All we lack is confirmation. You will return to the bakery tomorrow. Speak with Del Bishop again. Inquire, gently, whether he noticed the woman interacting. With any other staff, particularly Paige. You think Paige was in on it? I think Paige is a woman who dislikes her employer, has financial troubles and resents her position. Whether she acted alone or under influence remains to be seen. But we will find out. That night, I got a call from Saul. He'd followed Melinda Cairn to a late-night diner on Canal Street, where she met, of all people, Paige Kroll. Talked for 20 minutes, Saul said. No hug, no handshake. Business tone. Paige handed her an envelope. Cairn left. Paige stayed and ate pie. That sealed it. I called Wolfe. He didn't even grunt. She was bought, he said simply. Cairn was the hand. Page was the wallet. And the motive, Archie, was not just sabotage. It was opportunity. I frowned. You think she meant to frame Alva? Take over? No. Not take over. But perhaps trigger a collapse that would leave her with leverage. Page has a minor ownership. Stake, 5%. If Buttercrumbs fails and Alva sells, Page could buy in cheap, or leverage her insider status for a job elsewhere. High-stakes bakery warfare. Precisely. We will now arrange our guests. You want everyone here? Yes, Wolfe said, settling back into his chair with a heavy finality. All suspects. Tomorrow at 5. I intend to demonstrate that mixing deceit into batter is a recipe for disgrace, sir, I smiled. With or without cinnamon? Phooey, Wolfe said. Bring them all. And Archie, bring the mixing bowl. At precisely 5 o'clock the following evening, the Brownstones' front door closed behind the last of our guests, with a sound that was more final than friendly. They filed into Wolfe's office like reluctant jurors, each trying to look innocent, confused, or just annoyed that they'd been summoned. Wolfe didn't rise to greet them naturally. He remained planted in the oversized chair behind his desk, the calm at the center of the storm, while I played usher, and occasionally glare interpreter. On the couch sat Alva Strickland, her hands tightly folded in her lap, chin lifted in quiet defiance. Page Kroll perched on the far armrest of a side chair, legs crossed and lips set in a subtle sneer. Del Bishop sat stiffly, knees close together, eyes darting like a trapped rabbit. Isaiah Green leaned against the wall near the windows, arms folded, saying nothing. And between them all, the real guest of honor, Melinda Cairn. She looked smaller in person than she had under Saul's surveillance report. Her beige sweater had a soft pill to it, her brown hair was still in that practical bun, and her clipboard, absent today, had been replaced with an off-brand handbag she clutched like a parachute. Wolfe opened his eyes. That was the signal. Thank you all for attending. I trust Mr. Goodwin explained the nature of your invitation. There was a polite murmur of acknowledgement, the kind people use when they're not sure if the person speaking is a genius or a lunatic. Wolfe didn't wait for full commitment. I am investigating an act of deliberate sabotage that occurred at the Golden Spoon competition last week. Specifically the adulteration of a crumb cake batter, resulting in the discrediting of Buttercrumbs Bakery and the near death of an assistant named Milo Vance. Alva flinched slightly. Page didn't. Wolfe gestured toward the middle of the room where I'd placed the infamous mixing bowl, gleaming stainless steel, recently scrubbed, but still bearing the faint scratches of frequent use. This, he said, is the bowl that was used to hold the compromised batter. It is not the original mixing vessel assigned for that purpose. That one, ceramic, blue and chipped at the rim, was found later empty and improperly cleaned. A swap was made, quietly, subtly. He let the words hang there, the way a magician holds up the deck before the reveal. Now, several things are known, he continued. First, the cinnamon used was not only inferior, it was contaminated with acrylamide and bitterant. Second, Mr. Vance, loyal to Mrs. Strickland and blessed, or cursed, with a hypersensitive palate, noticed the flavor was wrong. He tasted the batter, reacted immediately, and collapsed. Third, the sabotage was not random. It was calculated. The goal was not murder, but humiliation. Page shifted in her seat. Melinda didn't move. And fourth, Wolfe said, this. Young woman Melinda Cairn was present that morning under false pretenses. She posed as a Golden Spoon official. She was not. Del gasped. Alva turned her head sharply. Isaiah muttered something under his breath that sounded like figures. Wolfe nodded at Melinda. Miss Cairn, your attendance was arranged through our short-term culinary staffing agency. Your employer, Miss Cecilia Dunn, has confirmed that she paid you directly. You were instructed to observe, but in fact, you interfered. You lingered near the spice rack. You touched the mixing bowls. I handled the vanilla. Melinda's voice came out small. I didn't poison anyone. No, Wolfe agreed. You applied the contaminated cinnamon. Pre-mixed, subtle. Enough to ruin a recipe, enough to make someone sick, but not kill. Her eyes darted to Paige, and that was all Wolfe needed. He turned slightly. Miss Kroll, you met with Miss Cairn. The night after the incident, you handed her an envelope. You claimed it was reimbursement for an event expense, but I have every reason to believe it was payment. That's a lie, Paige said, her voice flat. Wolfe raised a hand. I do not make accusations without basis. Mr. Panzer, who observed your meeting, saw no event materials, just cash. Furthermore, you have a motive, resentment. You dislike Mrs. Strickland. You feel unappreciated. You have financial strain. You possess enough familiarity with the kitchen to plan a quiet swap and enough distance to let someone else execute it. I didn't poison anyone, Paige snapped. No, Wolfe said calmly, but you engineered the opportunity for someone else to do it. You gave Melinda access. You told her when to appear. You left the mixing area unattended long enough. For the swap to occur, you made sure the original bowl was washed to destroy traces. Paige's eyes were sharp now. You can't prove it. Wolfe's voice lowered. You were counting on that, but you underestimated the persistence of scent. The cinnamon jar you used retained trace elements of the additive. It was not completely washed. The lab identified your fingerprints inside the lid. You were the last person to handle it before the competition. That finally cracked her. Her mouth opened, then closed again, the way a door slams in a wind. Melinda looked at her in disbelief. You said no one would get hurt. Shut up, Paige hissed. No, Wolfe said, voice rising. She will not. You involved an accomplice under false assurances. You endangered a man's life. You compromised a public event. And for what? Petty vengeance? A business opportunity? There was silence, deep, stretching, and shameful. Then, Paige said very softly, I just wanted her to fail once, just once. Alva let out a slow breath. You could have told me you felt that way. You didn't have to. Yes, I did. Paige stood now, trembling. You didn't listen. You never did. You smiled and nodded and gave me $10 an hour and thought that was enough. I built that bakery with you, and I'm still behind the counter like it's year one. I thought if you crashed just once, maybe someone would finally notice me. Dell stared at her like she'd grown antlers. Isaiah just shook his head. Wolfe gestured to me, and I stepped forward. Detective Harold is waiting in the front room. He'll take it from here. Paige went without resistance. Melinda followed, half-dazed. Alva sat in silence. After the room cleared, Wolfe finally rose. He crossed slowly to the window, the light catching the curve of his cheek. She did not understand, he murmured. Baking is not about defeat. It is about balance, precision. Respect. He turned toward me. Archie, let us not have cinnamon for a month, I grinned. Doctor's orders? Sanity's orders. And with that the brownstone exhaled. Order restored. Recipe complete. After the suspects had gone, the office fell into its usual hush, the kind that comes after a storm. Fritz appeared like a ghost with Wolfe's beer and a plate of slices from a duck breast he'd been marinating for 2 days. Wolfe didn't say a word as it was set before him. He was still standing at the window, as if whatever thoughts were simmering behind his eyes needed just a few more moments to reduce to something digestible. I stayed seated on the red couch, jotting notes while everything was still fresh. Cases like this didn't come with easy headlines. No smoking gun, no body on the floor. Just a silent act of spite, stirred slowly until it curdled. The kind of sabotage that couldn't be fixed with a mop or an apology. Wolfe finally turned. You will inform Mr. Kramer of the confession. Miss Kroll and Miss Cairn are to be charged. Let the district attorney determine the severity. Aye. Already spoke to Harold. He's got them in separate rooms downtown. Melinda's singing like a jazz bird. Paige is trying to deny everything, but she's not good at it anymore. Why? She never was. Wolfe sat down, forked a slice of duck, and chewed with a grim sort of reverence. She imagined herself the victim of neglect, but she underestimated the responsibility that comes with recognition. She almost got someone killed, yes, because she treated malice like an ingredient, measured, added, and folded in. He sipped his beer. There are fools who believe harm is justified if it results in personal elevation. They fail to account for the rise of consequence. He closed his eyes briefly. That was as close to emotion as Wolfe usually allowed. Then he set down his fork and fixed his gaze on me. You handled yourself with acceptable competence. I raised a brow. That your version of high praise? I have no higher version, I grinned. Then I'll take it. The doorbell rang, and before I could make a move, Fritz was already down the hall. A minute later he returned with Alva Strickland in tow. She looked different, still regal, still upright, but the steel in her spine had softened. She held a small bakery box tied with a ribbon, the kind meant to say, "Thank you," without saying it. "I wanted to bring this personally," she said, "and to thank both of you." Wolfe eyed the box suspiciously. "Is it edible?" She smiled faintly. "Yes, no cinnamon, just lemon." "That is acceptable." I gestured for her to sit, and she did. "The police interviewed me again this morning," she said. "I told them everything I knew, which wasn't much. Paige never gave me the slightest hint of what she was planning." "She didn't plan with clarity," Wolfe said, "only with resentment." Alva nodded. "Still, I can't help but feel responsible. I should have noticed. I should have talked to her." "You did not owe her a confession booth, Mrs. Strickland," Wolfe said bluntly. "You employed her. You trusted her. She abused that trust. Her choices are hers, not yours." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I've decided to close the bakery, temporarily." Wolfe's brow lifted. "You are not under legal threat." "No. But the reputation needs to be rebuilt. The public may forgive a mistake. It's slower to forgive uncertainty." "A practical decision." He nodded once. "You will reopen?" "Eventually. Smaller. Simpler. I want to do the baking again. Myself for a while." Wolfe seemed satisfied with that. He gestured to the box. "Leave it on the tray. Fritz will see to it." Alva stood and I walked her out. On the stoop she turned to me. "You know," she said, "Milo woke up yesterday." I blinked. "You serious?" "Very groggy, but talking. Doctors say he'll recover." He asked about the competition. I told him it didn't matter anymore. He smiled, said, "I knew something smelled off." I smiled too. "He's got a good nose." "Yes, and a good heart." She paused. "Do me a favor, Mr. Goodwin. Tell Wolfe thank you in your own way. I always do." She nodded and walked away, blending into the late spring crowd like just another New Yorker with something on her mind. When I got back inside, Wolfe was already leaning back in his chair, fingers steepled. "She left," I said. "And you'll be pleased to know Milo's conscious." A fortunate side effect. I dropped into the red chair. This one was different. No body, no bullets. Just sabotage with a garnish of betrayal. Wolfe didn't open his eyes. "A crime does not require blood to be vile, Archie. It merely requires the violation of trust." We sat in silence for a minute, the way we often did after things wrapped up. The orchids overhead glowed faintly in the late afternoon light. The air was calm again, order restored. "Which meant, I suppose," Wolfe said with reluctant gravity, "that I may reconsider cinnamon in limited contexts." I grinned. "Fritz will be thrilled. He was worried about the snickerdoodle embargo." Pfui. Anyway, case closed. Balance restored and no one died. "For once," Wolfe muttered, but the corner of his mouth twitched. The brownstone had seen worse. Murder, extortion, fraud, scandal. But it wasn't the drama that Wolfe hated. It was the chaos, the unpredictability, someone tampering with something sacred, like a mixing bowl or a man's honor. This time, the bowl had been recovered. The culprit caught, the batter set right, and dinner was served on time just the way Wolfe liked it. The next morning, the world tried its best to return to normal, and for once, it almost succeeded. For it served an omelette laced with shaved black truffle, Wolfe's idea of starting the day with dignity, and even the orchids in the plant rooms seemed to be standing straighter, as if they too had survived the moral humidity of the week before. I was halfway through the Gazette crossword when Wolfe spoke from across the room, still chewing with unhurried resolve. "Archie, Have the Strickland insurance documents arrived?" "They have, delivered by courier at 7 this morning. I'd have woken you if I thought they were explosive," he grunted. "Bring them." I retrieved the packet from the credenza and dropped it on his desk. He opened the folder like a man inspecting an adversary's surrender letter. For the next 5 minutes, all I heard was the sound of paper shifting, and Wolfe's occasional sniff, either of approval or disdain, impossible to tell. Finally, he set them down. "She was cautious," he said. "You mean Alva?" "Yes. Her new policy included clauses that covered defamation-related losses, event disqualification due to tampering, and even replacement staff in case of internal misconduct." Sounds like someone expecting betrayal. "No," Wolfe said. "Someone who has already experienced it." I gave him a look. "You think the story she gave us, the one about the bakery falling apart 10 years ago, was incomplete?" "I'm certain of it. Paige wasn't her first internal conflict. Merely her most recent. The clause additions align precisely with the timeline of Cecilia Dunn's reappearance in the culinary scene." "So you're saying Cecilia might have tried this before?" "Not necessarily with cinnamon, but with sabotage? Possibly." Alva learned to prepare for knives in the back disguised as spatulas. I leaned back in my chair. She didn't say anything. She wouldn't. She's proud. But more to the point, the past doesn't matter to me unless it informs the present, and in this case, it may explain why she hired Milo, why she trusted him. Because he reminded her what loyalty looked like exactly. And it explains why Paige's betrayal cut so deep. It wasn't the sabotage, it was that Alva believed naively that she had already faced the worst her profession could offer. He closed the folder. "Humans, Archie, do not learn from triumphs, they learn from injuries if they are fortunate." Before I could respond, the phone rang. I picked it up. Nero Wolfe's residence. Archie Goodwin speaking. "Mr. Goodwin." It was a woman's voice. Cool, crisp, and unfamiliar. "This is Julia Milcroft. I'm legal counsel for Cecilia Dunn." That got my attention. "What can I do for you, Ms. Milcroft?" "I'd like to speak with Mr. Wolfe, briefly. In person." "About?" "A matter tangential to your recent investigation. Miss Dunn would prefer not to escalate, but she has concerns." I cupped the receiver. "Wolfe, lawyer, Dunn's, wants a word. Tangential matter." He frowned. "Admit her at 11. Relayed the message. Ms. Milcroft confirmed, thanked me with the kind of precise politeness that usually preceded litigation, and hung up. "Well," I said, "looks like the cinnamon dust hasn't settled." At 11 on the dot, Julia Milcroft arrived. Mid-30s, tailored navy suit, glasses perched on her nose like punctuation. She looked like she charged by the quarter hour, and liked it that way. Wolfe didn't rise, of course, but he did incline his head slightly as she entered. For him, that was practically a curtsy. "Miss Milcroft," he said, "state your business." She sat, crossed one leg over the other, and opened a folder that matched her suit. "Miss Dunn has no intention of filing a formal complaint. However, she's aware that your associate made inquiries into her private affairs, specifically the activities of her employee, Melinda Cairn." "Reasonable inquiries," Wolfe said. Given Miss Cairns' impersonation of an event official and her role in poisoning a public food entry, Miss Cairn is no longer in Miss Dunn's employ, Millcroft said quickly. She acted independently, but I am instructed to ask that your notes on Miss Dunn's business operations not be shared publicly. Wolfe steepled his fingers. Are you suggesting I withhold facts from an ongoing legal matter? No, Mr. Wolfe, I'm suggesting discretion. We understand your investigation is concluded, and Miss Dunn values her privacy. Wolfe considered this. You wish to protect her reputation? Yes, Wolfe sighed. I have no interest in damaging it, but I will not bury details if the truth demands them. Millcroft nodded once. Understood. Miss Dunn also asked me to express her professional regret. She did not anticipate Miss Cairn would involve herself so destructively. I arched a brow. She paid her, didn't she? Millcroft paused. She compensated her. For market research, not sabotage. Wolfe grunted. A delicate distinction. Nonetheless, it stands. Very well, Wolfe said. You may tell Miss Dunn that if she prefers to remain on the periphery of scandal, she would be wise to remain off the battlefield. Millcroft gave a tight smile. I will pass that along. She stood, offered a short nod, and left. When the door clicked shut, Wolfe turned to me. She is trying to plug leaks in a sinking vessel. Cecilia? Yes. She started something and lost control of it. Melinda acted too broadly. Paige acted too selfishly. And the result is a legal headache and a ruined pastry. So she's backing away quietly, as people often do when their fingerprints aren't quite invisible. That afternoon, the final loose end wrapped itself up when a modest envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a simple note on ivory cardstock. Mr. Wolfe, thank you. The bakery will reopen in June. The menu will be simpler, the staff smaller. But the cinnamon will be tested twice. Alva Strickland. Wolfe read it, folded it, and handed it to me without a word. Then he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. I tucked the note into our case file and wrote on the top of the folder, the murder in the mixing bowl. Closed. It wasn't the most dramatic case we'd ever had. No smoking gun, no chase across rooftops, just a tainted spice jar, a lie whispered in beige, and a friendship that crumbled like stale crust. But Nero Wolfe didn't need bodies to solve a crime, just a bit of logic, a lot of stillness, and a man who knew when something didn't smell right. And this time, he'd saved a bakery, cleared an innocent name, and put 2 petty saboteurs behind bars, all without leaving his chair, which, if you ask him, is the only proper way to serve justice. That evening, the brownstone settled back into its usual rhythm. Fritz was in the kitchen prepping a braised oxtail with celeriac puree, and the soft hiss of boiling stock filtered through the floorboards like ambient music for the civilized. Wolfe remained in the office, having resumed his self-appointed role as caretaker of peace and order in an otherwise intolerable world. I sat at my desk by the bookshelves, reviewing the final entries in my case notes and trying to decide if attempted culinary homicide belonged under betrayal or sabotage. Wolfe would argue that it was an intersection of both, but he wasn't the one who had to file these things in our cabinet without developing a system that required a Latin degree. The sardine case had wrapped neatly, efficiently, and with the kind of psychological precision that was Wolfe's trademark. No blood had been spilled, no gun drawn, but reputations had been broken, careers rearranged, and perhaps most importantly, dinner had not been delayed. And that, to Wolfe, was the truest measure of justice. He spoke without opening his eyes. Archie, yes, sir, you received a copy of the medical report? I did. Straight from Detective Harold. Milo's clear. The residual toxins have left his system. They're keeping him for observation another 2 days, but he's conscious and cracking jokes about becoming a spice taster for the FDA. Good. What about Paige? Still in custody. Confessions holding. Her arraignment is set for next week. She's retained a defense attorney who specializes in crimes of passion, which, I guess, covers cinnamon. Wolfe sniffed. Phooey. Passion is no excuse for cowardice. Melinda Cairn, charged as an accessory, likely to plead out. She has no priors and a resume built on disappointment. I expect her to vanish into another job, another kitchen, another act of mediocrity. You're a real beacon of optimism, you know that? Wolfe grunted. I am a realist, it is enough. I finished my notes and closed the case file with a satisfying snap. Then I walked over to the liquor cabinet and poured myself a small scotch. Not because the case had been especially harrowing, but because sometimes a man deserves a drink just for steering around a disaster without hitting a pedestrian. Wolfe, of course, declined. He preferred beer and discipline. We sat in silence for a while, me sipping, him thinking. The house was quiet in that special way it gets after resolution, as if even the walls were exhaling. Eventually he said, "You noticed, I assume, that Cecilia Dunn has not denied sending Melinda Cairn. She hasn't confirmed it either." "Exactly. She is hedging, preparing for the storm to shift. If public opinion begins to suspect her involvement, she will recast herself as a victim of manipulation." "You think she'll get away with it?" "I think she already has. In the court of law, perhaps not entirely, but in the court of public opinion, where gossip is currency and memory is brief, she will recover." I nodded. "And Alva?" Wolfe's brow furrowed slightly. "She will survive, stronger but sadder, because of Paige." "Yes, that betrayal will not wash out with the batter." He paused. "You know I abhor sentiment, Archie. I'm familiar, but I am not indifferent to it. Loyalty is not a tool, it is a virtue, and when it is violated, the injury is personal." I was quiet for a beat. "You liked Milo?" Wolfe sniffed. "He had integrity. That is rare, even among bakers." At 7, Fritz entered with a cart and a faint smile. "Dinner is ready, sir. Shall I serve the oxtail in the dining room?" "Yes," Wolfe said, rising slowly. "And Fritz?" "Yes, sir. No cinnamon tonight." Fritz gave the slightest bow. "Of course not, sir." As we made our way to the dining room, Wolfe paused in the doorway and turned back toward the office. "A mixing bowl," he said thoughtfully, "is a simple tool. Shallow, circular, unassuming. But what it holds, what it becomes, is entirely dependent on the hands that use it." He glanced at me. "Much like justice." I raised an eyebrow. "You comparing yourself to a bowl now?" "I'm comparing myself to the function," he said, "not the shape." We sat down to dinner. Oxtail, celeriac, a red wine with just enough bite to cleanse the palate between truths. Wolfe savored each bite with the deliberation of a man who believed civilization hinged on well-executed meals. And in a way, he was right. After the plates were cleared and the second beer poured, I asked the question that had been rolling around my brain since Melinda's arrest. "Wolfe, if Milo hadn't tasted that batter, if he hadn't noticed anything, would we have caught them? Would we have known?" Wolfe took his time before answering. "Eventually, perhaps. But it would have been more difficult. Without a catalyst, injustice often goes unnoticed." He lifted his glass. "To those who notice." Lifted mine. "And to the ones who don't poison the cake." He smirked faintly. Then we drank. The evening wound down the way Wolfe preferred. Books, silence, digestion. I wrote up the final entry for the files and slipped the completed case folder onto the shelf between the rubber band and the silent speaker. It felt at home there. Before turning in for the night, I passed by Wolfe's office once more. He was back in his chair, eyes half closed, hands folded over his stomach like a philosopher. "Guarding a secret. Anything else, boss?" "No, Archie, that will be all." I paused, hand on the light switch. "You ever bake, Wolfe?" He cracked one eye open. "Never." but I respect the art, because, like truth, it does not forgive imprecision. I flipped the switch, leaving him in the half-lit glow of the orchids, and that was that. Another case closed, another lesson served. In Wolfe's world, the ingredients always mattered. Motive, method, opportunity, timing, temperature. Get just one wrong, and the whole thing falls flat, but get them right. Justice rises every time. The following Thursday, I took a walk through the kitchen at Buttercrumbs. It was quiet. Not the artificial silence you get after a crime scene's been scrubbed, but the kind of hush that says, "We're not done yet, but we're healing." The ovens were off, the prep counters clean. A new blue ceramic mixing bowl sat center stage like an heir to a throne. Milo was there, seated on a stool by the back window, wearing a sling and sipping coffee. His face looked a little paler than it had been a week ago, but the smirk was the same. "Archie," he said, "I hear I owe you and your boss a cake." "Just make it one that doesn't knock me out," I said. He laughed. "Deal." The case was closed. Paige Kroll and Melinda Cairn were both indicted. The DA was pursuing charges for criminal conspiracy and reckless endangerment. Wolfe's statement, delivered in his usual Baroque precision, had become the cornerstone of the prosecution's timeline. And while the press hadn't been allowed into the Brownstones' office for the grand reveal, thank heaven, word had gotten around that Nero Wolfe had cracked the cinnamon sabotage, as the tabloids had it, without rising from his chair. Back at the Brownstone, Wolfe had received 4 fresh crates of orchids, 2 unsolicited offers from culinary magazines, and 1 politely worded request from Cecilia Dunn's legal counsel not to include her name in any future remarks, public or private. Wolfe had responded with a sentence that ended in a period so final it practically had a headstone. He'd gone quiet in the days since, as he often did after an affair wrapped. He claimed it was digestion, but I knew better. Solving cases for Wolfe was like making a perfect sauce. You needed time off the flame to let everything settle. That evening I found him in the office, reading a treatise on the evolution of yeast cultures. I settled into the red chair with a scotch and a smug grin. "All quiet," I said. "Buttercrumbs is reopening next month. Alva's hiring 2 new assistants, one of whom used to run quality control at a food lab. Milo's consulting on ingredients. She's even naming a cookie after him." Wolfe sniffed. "Sentimentality cloaked as commerce. She's calling it the comeback crumb." His eyelid twitched, but he said nothing. I also got a thank you note from the Golden Spoon organizers. They said they're reconsidering their oversight policies. "Good," Wolfe said. "Oversight should never be delegated to amateurs. That is how mixing bowls vanish and poisons appear." I leaned forward slightly. "You know, for a man who detests chaos, you handled this one with a fair bit of grace." Wolfe raised his eyes. "I handled it with logic. Grace is incidental." I shrugged. "Still, no corpse, no bullet, just a bakery full of bitterness." It was a crime of ambition. And those, he said, are among the most corrosive, more dangerous than violence, because they are disguised as improvement. We sat quietly for a few moments. Then Wolfe said, "You notice the symmetry, of course." "What symmetry?" "The bowl," he said. "An object meant to mix, used to divide. That, Archie, is the perfect metaphor for human folly. We possess tools of creation, but some of us use them to destroy." I didn't say anything right away. It wasn't often Wolfe strayed into philosophy, but when he did, it usually hit with more weight than half the case files in our drawer. He stood, slowly, deliberately, and walked to the Globe Bar. A rare event. He poured himself an inch of brandy, then returned to his seat, glass untouched in his hand. "I will say this," he added, "for Mrs. Strickland." Yes, she knew before anyone else that the bowl had been changed. She didn't say it directly, But her instinct was immediate. She recognized the loss of balance. He sipped. That is a baker's gift. And a detective's. I raised my glass to that. The next morning I mailed a copy of the final report. To Inspector Kramer. He hadn't asked for it, but Wolfe insisted on sending it anyway. "Let the record show," he said, "that competence is not reserved for badges." Fritz prepared lemon scones for breakfast, and Wolfe accepted one without protest. When Fritz asked whether Cinnamon might be reinstated next week, Wolfe gave the most reluctant nod I've ever seen. Just like that, the world turned again. Another case solved, another balance restored. And in the brownstone, justice wasn't served. Warm or cold, it was plated with care, seasoned with truth, and never ever rushed.